My name is Ken Neubeck, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Evansville, Indiana in 1943. My father was in the military. War was still occurring. And I don't remember a whole lot about my early childhood, but I know that we went to live near family in New York City, near New York City. And went to Catholic schools for a couple of years, and then I went to public schools. And then we moved down to Virginia, to Northern Virginia, when I was in about the 7th or 8th grade. And I didn't realize at that time that I was moving into a racially segregated suburb of Washington, D.C., which has a very large African-American population. I only knew that something was a little amiss when I went into the school, and after a few days, some kids came up to me and said, "Would you sign a petition?" And I said, "Well, I guess. What's it for?" They said, "We want to keep the Grays out of school." I said, "The Grays? What are the Grays?" And they looked at one another and said, "You're not from here, are you?" I said, "No, I'm from New York, and I don't really quite understand this, so I don't think maybe I should sign it." Well, what I didn't realize was that they were asking me to sign a petition to keep blacks out of their school. It was a totally white school. It's one of the top-ranked junior, senior high schools in the country, according to U.S. News and World Report, or whatever that news magazine is. It ranks high schools every year. My classmates included the son of a congressman. One of my friends, his father was a captain in the Navy, a ship captain. These are people who are well off. We weren't well off. They were well off. As time went on, I began to realize what kind of situation I was in. My parents would take my sister and I on Sunday afternoons in the summer and drop us off at a motel swimming pool so that we could swim. And I didn't know why we did that. I knew there wasn't a public swimming pool in the city, but I didn't know why there wasn't a public swimming pool in the city. And it was because if the city had built a public swimming pool, that people who were black, and there were some living in the city of Falls Church, Virginia, would have to be able to swim in the pool. So rather than have that go on, they just didn't build the pool. So I went through all of high school without ever seeing a black student's face. I did see school buses loaded with black children passing our high school on the way further out into Fairfax County to their school, quote, their school. And I was just puzzled by the whole thing. I didn't have any political consciousness to speak of, and it wasn't anything that my parents ever talked about or mentioned to me. But then when I went to college, I went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., it was much the same thing. I was in Air Force ROTC, and I met my first black student who was in Air Force ROTC. I don't remember seeing or getting to know any other African Americans or other students of color the whole time that I was there. None of my professors were people of color. None of my teachers in high school had been people of color. It was really kind of an eye-opening thing as I began to sort of feel there's something wrong with this picture. And so I was working for the summer for the federal government. I paid my way through school, which you could do back in those days. And I got to know a couple of people, and they said, "Well, you're graduating soon. You're a sociology major. We think that you've taken a course in what they called race relations back in those days. There's a new program opening up. Maybe you'd like to think about joining us in that." And I said, "What is that?" They said, "Well, Congress just passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and now we have the tools to force school desegregation in the South and border states. We can withhold money from school districts that don't desegregate. And there's going to be a need for a lot of education of the people in those schools, because if we're going to bring black students into all white schools and black teachers into all white faculty schools, people need to start learning some new things." So I said, yeah. So I was one of the first employees in what at that point was called the Equal Educational Opportunities Program, and it was part of what was then called the U.S. Office of Education. Now we have a Department of Education, but at that point it was a smaller kind of thing. But there was a lot of money coming out of the federal government at that point for elementary and secondary education. And so school districts all around the country wanted to lay their hands on that. And but in the southern border states, they were being threatened with withholding of money. So I was put into the educational side of it and put in charge of identifying materials that could be sent out to teachers. We also had summer workshops where we brought Black and white teachers together, perhaps maybe for the first time for most of them. And they had to have materials that they could read and share, and discuss and talk about. And so I helped to compile those kinds of things. I made a couple of field trips. I remember going down one to the University of Florida in Gainesville. And I was at some kind of meeting, and it was an integrated meeting. And a woman I met there offered to give me a ride back to where I was staying. And so she was driving, and I got in the car. She said, it's okay for you to be in this car with me on the campus, but we don't do this off campus. And I thought to myself, my God, this is unbelievable. And I didn't know anything. I mean, I really didn't know anything. And so I worked there for 2 years, and then there was an opportunity to work in a research branch of the U.S. Office of Education. So I moved over there and found that everybody around me had PhDs, and I didn't have one. I was getting my master's. And so I thought maybe I should go back to school and get a PhD, and I could do more things. And that's in 1968 when I went to Washington University in St. Louis. I arrived at the time that the anti-war movement was starting to really build. The women's movement was starting to stir. The environmental movement, first Earth Day was 1970, was also starting to perk. A lot of things were happening in that period. Woodstock was in 1969. You get the idea. I came into there as a guy in a suit and tie, haircut just correct, and no political feelings whatsoever, but always curious. I wanted to know what was going on. I was totally transformed by my 3 years of graduate school because of the things that were going on around me, but also the things we talked about in class, the books we were encouraged to read and to use. And I came out of there I had dark hair then, my version of an afro, and my version of a beard, wearing blue work shirts and jeans and work boots, and just looking like any other hippie would look. Although I really wasn't into the whole hippie lifestyle, I was much more into the political side of the movement, and got my first job then at the University of Connecticut. And I went roaring in there with all kinds of things in my mind about class inequality and institutionalized racism and so forth. And those were two areas that I specialized in, was poverty and racism. And I continued that in my teaching, in my writings. My first, well, it wasn't my first book, it might have been my third book, it was called Welfare Racism, Playing the Race Card Against America's Poor. So I was able to combine my interest in both racism and poverty by showing how racism made a huge impact on people's thinking about welfare policy and who should get it. And one of the reasons it was so penurious and there was so little was given to people was because nobody wanted to help African Americans. But the funny thing was that most of the people on welfare were white. And so this was coming back around to hurt whites as well, the attitudes of racism toward blacks in that instance. So I did a lot of teaching. When my books came out, I would go and talk about them. Welfare Racism book was well recognized by my professional colleagues, and I thought it was an important book because welfare reform, was just underway. The Clinton administration made sure that welfare reform occurred. It meant things like there were work requirements for the first time for recipients, that there was a time limit to how long you could have welfare. They just made it harder for people to get the very little that they were getting. And in comparison to what goes on in other nations with regard to poor people, people who are poor, we really look pretty sick. And that was when I wrote the book, When Welfare Disappears, The Case for Economic Human Rights. So, as I mentioned earlier, I got involved in a study group with professors from all different departments, political science, chemistry, biology, who were interested in human rights. Who would have known? And those who could try to figure out ways in which they could incorporate that into their teaching or into their writing. And that influenced me a great deal in terms of putting on a human rights lens and thinking about using that both in my professional work, my writing primarily, but also in community work. And so arriving in Eugene, one of the first things I did, besides finishing up the book on When Welfare Disappears, was to look around for a group that was dealing with human rights issues. And that's my 20 years of volunteer activity in Eugene started at that time. And I've been pretty consistent in pressing that lens because I think it's a very valuable one. It's one that's understood internationally. I'm a East Coaster that have come here 20 years ago to settle because of my oldest son had started a family. And once I was here, I had visited previously, really liked it. And so my wife and I decided to move out here, drove the 3,000 miles in a Subaru wagon with a 100-pound golden retriever and a psycho cat that needed medicine to stop meowing. But and then once I got here, I had been a professor at the University of Connecticut, and I had a couple of books that I hadn't finished. So that was my main priority when I got out here. And then when I finished doing that, I began looking around for some volunteer work that I could do. And that's how I entered into the human rights part of my career here in Eugene. So the last 20 years, I'm involved in one way or another in various kinds of work with the community and in the community, on behalf of the community, behind the community, and basically have learned so much. And I'm even told I've made an impact, but sometimes it's hard to know what your impact really is. But I've enjoyed it a great deal. Well, when I was at the University of Connecticut, and I was there for 32 years, toward the end, a study group formed around human rights. I was a sociology professor, and I had never thought about framing what I talked about in class or what I wrote about with a human rights lens. But as I went in the study group, I learned much more, and we decided to start a human rights minor in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was made the first director of the human rights minor. And I did that for 2 years until I retired in 2003. But that really set my mind going, and I decided I wanted to do another book, which I did, and I finished after I was here for a few years. It's called When Welfare Disappears: The Case for Economic Human Rights, because at that time there was a great deal of animosity toward welfare on the part of conservatives, political conservatives in the country. And I wanted to sort of remind people that human rights existed, and there was a human right to an adequate standard of living, human right to housing, to food, clothing, and so forth, not to mention healthcare and many other things that go along with it. And so I wrote that book, and around the same time, I was looking for actual volunteer opportunities. And there was a group in town called Amigos Multicultural Services Center. And they had a house that was donated, dedicated for them, a very small nonprofit group, Amigos. And they would host a family that was escaping political violence and torture in Central America. And I thought, well, this is something I can get into. I don't really know on the East Coast we didn't really have at that point in time any sense of a large Mexican or Central American or South American population. That's all changed, obviously, since then. But I wanted to learn more about this whole thing, and I was aware of some of the Civil War activity going on in Central America. So I joined them, and they were kind of in a transitional crisis situation. They were trying to redefine what their mission was. And I said, well, why don't you think of immigrant rights as human rights? And that kind of set off in motion a lot of things, including a youth group that was started to train youth as human rights ambassadors in the city of Eugene. And they would go out, and these were youth that had come up from Mexico or Central America, escaping violence. Often they were undocumented. Often they were had themselves been witnesses to violence in their families, or they themselves were threatened with violence. And so there was a lot of healing to do. And we did that by getting them involved in the community in a sense of empowering them to make social change. And so they did things like they made a video of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has about 30 articles, and they acted out each of the articles in the video, and that was presented at Eugene Human Rights Commission annual Human Rights Day, and then put on the City of Eugene website. So they did things like that. They joined up with LGBTQ students in their school, and together they fought bullying and had forums on how you treat people and what kinds of human rights violations are occurring when you engage in discrimination and things like that. And then they got involved with Native Americans and group in Northern California that they hooked up with, and the youth were made water warriors. They were actually ceremonially accepted into this group because they were there to support their efforts to gain water rights, which was crucial to their ceremonies and their food and everything else. So I was involved with Migos. I was on the board. They made me the executive director, and my main and I did this without pay because it's volunteer work, right? And I turned out to be their grant writer. I knew how to write grants, in the university setting, but I had no idea how to write grants in a nonprofit world. There's a lot of competition. And so I took some workshops and got some help from some friends I met here in Eugene. And so I was able to get grants coming in from various places, which were then used almost entirely for the youth, to enable the youth to do things. And so that was a really rewarding time for me. At the same time, I began to meet a lot of people in the community who were Latinos. And I would go to meetings, and people knew who I was and what I was doing. And even though I'm not Latino, they saw me actually doing something helpful and useful for their own community. And through that, I met the woman who was the chair of the Human Rights Commission in town. And I was very curious as to why they handed out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the only human right that they seemed to be dealing with was the right to be free from discrimination that the commission was dealing with. And I asked her, and I said, around the country, in other settings, there are people trying to bring human rights to bear at the local level. And they're not just things that happen outside the country or whatever, but you can actually take these principles and apply them within businesses, within local government, at universities, throughout the community. And so I sent an email to the chair of the Human Rights Commission, and she accidentally responded to it. Didn't know she was sending it to me. She said in her email, "Who is this guy? Do we really need to take on more projects like this?" And I emailed her back and I said, "I don't think I was really supposed to get this." Well, she was so mortified, and she's a wonderful woman. She's well known in the Latino community. And she was mortified. She said, "Well, will you come in here to the Human Rights Commission and make a pitch for what you think you want to do?" So I went in there and I appeared and I talked about the notion of implementing human rights at the local level. And they liked it. There were several members of the commission who said, "I'll work with you on that." And so that she she asked me to chair a subcommittee. I wasn't even on the commission, and she asked me to chair a subcommittee, and I had commissioners who would be volunteers with me. And so we began to do a lot of things. We began to talk to city staff about this whole concept and get their response. We talked. I talked at the City Club of Eugene. We did op-ed pieces in the newspaper to sort of get the whole idea out in the community. That we could be thinking about human rights and how they applied to things that were going on in Eugene. And so that was actually very successful. I got support from the city manager, who was John Reese at that time, and from the mayor, who was Kitty Piercy at that time. And I began to become known within the city, for this advocate for making Eugene a human rights city. Well, this project was developing in other countries as well. Human rights cities were being examined and implemented elsewhere. And so Kitty Piercy began getting invitations to go and attend meetings and conferences. And the biggest one was in South Korea. And well, she couldn't go. And so guess who they asked to go to South Korea? South Korea was paying, all the expenses and everything like that. And so I went, and I remember sitting on a panel, and I looked out, and there were like 500 or 600 people there with microphones on, getting translations from my English into Korean. And I met some wonderful, wonderful people. And then a couple of years later, the same thing happened with Sweden. And I was invited to go, and they, again, Sweden paid for everything. I represented the city of Eugene. I represented Kitty Piercy, and again, it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. By that time, I was able to talk about some of the things we were doing in Eugene within the city government, changes that we were making, and that was very interesting to people who came from places where that kind of thing was not going on. And I also learned about things that were going on that I thought, well, maybe we can bring back here to Eugene. So I was very much invested in the human rights city kind of thing. But another thing that happened while I was on the Human Rights Commission, I got exposed to a lot of different kinds of people, people that I might not otherwise have met or gotten to know about. For example, the trans population here in Eugene, and other groups, Muslims, and people who are homeless. And I realized I was sitting on a commission that was making policy decisions and recommendations about homelessness, but I had never met a homeless person before. So that I said, well, I got to get out of my comfort zone. I got to learn. I got to learn from the mouth of the people who are experiencing this, because I always had the feeling that human rights are things, if they're being violated, that the fight against the violation should be led by the people who are being violated. And those of us who are fortunate enough not to be violated should be their allies and provide support and follow them and do what they try to accomplish with them, what they were trying to do. So I began to volunteer at the Egan Warming Centers, which here in Eugene opens up when it turns 30 degrees or below, and various churches and a synagogue and I think Lane Community College open up spaces for people to go and sleep and be warm and get a couple of meals and things like that. And that was really interesting because I was able to hear the stories of some of the people who were there, and people of all ages, people of all backgrounds, men and women, youth. And I just began to understand that it was much more complicated than maybe the general public was thinking that it was. And I was a sociologist, and I'd even written a little bit in a social problems textbook about homelessness, but I realized that I didn't really know anything. Or I certainly didn't know enough about homelessness. So there was another opportunity to volunteer, and that was with Occupy Medical, which was another nonprofit. This one provided free medical care to persons who needed it, no matter who came in. But it was largely people who were low income and people who were homeless. And I started out working there, and they already were dedicated to human rights. I was handed a a T-shirt to wear that said on the front Occupy Medical, and on the back it said healthcare is a human right. So I was writing my element of pushing for human rights. And I started out being a peacekeeper because often people who were not there for medical assistance or anything like that, but were just friends or hangers out or whatever, would be there. And sometimes disagreements would occur. We also had people who were people on drugs. We had people who were mentally challenged and mental illness. So things happened, and fortunately, never anything very violent. But I had to learn how to be a de-escalator. I had to be able to walk up to people who were going at one another and calm things down and stop it. And that was all new to me. I never had to do that. When I was a college professor, I dealt with primarily upper middle class white students from affluent small towns in Connecticut, and just a look from me would stop any arguments that were going on because they were at college and they didn't want to make the professor mad. But this was a whole thing. I didn't have any rep, I didn't have any street cred. I just had that T-shirt, and I would just explain to people that, look, we're trying to get medical care to people here. Some people can be triggered by your voices and your argument, and it would be really good if you could take it elsewhere or just keep it down. And it worked. It always worked. And there were usually 2 or 3 of us on the peacekeeping job at the same time. So at Occupy Medical, the people there looked at me and they said, well, you seem to be very calm in the midst of all this. What about doing some crisis counseling? I said, well, I've never done crisis counseling. Again, thinking back to the population at the University of Connecticut, the students I counseled, it was a very, very different kind of thing. I said, well, I'll try, and they said, okay, yeah, just, and I also took some workshops and things like that along the way. But I was, again, amazed at the kinds of problems that people would bring to me and that I had to figure out how I was going to respond, what advice I could give. Usually I gave them options. I always started with, well, you can do nothing. And then I would say, but here's an agency that deals with that. Or you can just come back and see me again if I'm doing any good here, talking with you. And so I dealt with suicidal ideation. I dealt with sexual attack. I dealt with a situation in which a husband took a child and went to his mother's house to live and wouldn't give it back to the woman. I dealt with people who, there was one woman who, I don't know how to label people, schizophrenic maybe, but she heard voices coming out of walls wherever she lived. And she was homeless and living on the street. And some guy offered her the opportunity to sleep at his apartment, but then he raped her. So I'm thinking to myself, I don't know how to deal with the schizophrenia part of that, but I do know how to deal with the sexual assault. And she came back to see me about 3 weeks later and thanked me that she had actually gotten, with an agency and was getting some advice and protection and things like that. It reminded me a lot of teaching at college, where you can have great classes and great students, and then they'll leave, and you never really know what kind of an impact that you made upon them. Except you might run into one of them in a mall sometime, and they say, "I remember that class where you had us all fighting with one another, and I learned so much out of that." But that was really useful. The woman whose husband took her child, I gave her all kinds of suggestions about going to legal aid and going to this women's organization, and all kinds of ideas. And she kept saying, no, I can't do that. My husband will be so angry, I'll never get the child back. Well, about 2 weeks later, the director of Occupy Medical, the clinic director, came and said, do you remember that young woman, very young, like 22 or something like that you talked to a couple of weeks ago about her child? And I said, yeah, I do. Well, she's going into court next week with a lawyer. She did exactly what you suggested that she should do. So those things were very gratifying. There were also days when I was so shaken by a situation that I heard and that I had to interact around that I would call the clinic director and say, I need to debrief. I need help here. I need to know if what I did was right, you know. And so we had, some of that going on as well. But the homelessness thing was, that was the last thing I really, really got heavily involved with. And I would help. I made numbers of friends of people who were doing volunteer work, and I would go with them, and we would help people move their tents. If the police told them to, or if they heard a raid was coming. I worked. Occupy Medical had kind of a kitchen set up outside, and serving food to people, and I would serve food and so forth, and so I get pretty heavily involved with that. The last thing I did at the Human Rights Commission, which is memorable to me, is that we were getting kind of sounds that many groups in the city were not being heard by the city government, that they had problems as well. And so a member of the commission, Bonnie Souza, and I set up 10 different focus groups to talk intensively with people from a variety of different groups, the Latin American community, and I think we had a separate one for Latin American families. We had one for youth, African American youth, and African American adults. We had Muslim, and we had to work with people who are in these communities to help us do the recruitment. Because, for example, I didn't know anybody in the Muslim community except one guy who was on the Human Rights Commission, and he actually got me into the mosque, and I gave a little talk on what we were doing and why, and he helped me get people to come. Native Americans were probably among the most distrustful of the city government. Nothing really had ever been done for them, and I found them to be the most mistreated people of all the different groups that we spoke with. But they came and they talked. And the outcome of all this was a report that we did, which landed on the desk of current Mayor Lucy Vinis. And she liked it a lot. And we made recommendations for a number of things. One of them was to have a liaison between the city and these kinds of groups whose voices weren't being heard. And it's really hard to get the city to add something to the budget, but they did. They added a line item in the budget about 5 years ago now for a liaison who works to link the city to these various groups, tries to find out what's going on in the groups, what are the problems that are happening. So that was something that was really unusual that we accomplished. We also set up, we recommended that there be a place for groups to go and meet. It's like a multicultural center, because some groups had a place to go. Like the Muslims had their mosque, Native Americans had longhouses, both at Lane Community College and University of Oregon. But some groups really didn't have any place to go. And it was really hard for them to even find other people who were like them when they came to the community. Pacific Islanders, for example. There was no one place where you could go and meet Pacific Islanders. We had a focus group with them. First time they'd ever been asked, what kinds of issues do you guys have? And it was really incredibly interesting, because they would say, well, we didn't know we were people of color till we came into the United States. I mean, we don't judge one another on color shades and where we come from. It's more ethnicity and what family are you with, and where did you come from, and so forth. So that was really useful. So I got a good report out of it with some recommendations that were actually being implemented. The city's still trying to work on this whole notion, especially now with their budget being $50 million short. So it could be a long time before we see some of these things, but we try to make an impact. One last thing I'll mention is, while I was on the Human Rights Commission, with this whole concept of human rights city, I wanted to change the ordinance, the human rights ordinance that the city follows, to include things other than discrimination. Didn't want to exclude that, didn't want to minimize that, because that was so important. but we had several meetings with former members of human rights commissioners. I really tried to find sources of support for changing that ordinance. And the ordinance change basically said, that was proposed, basically said that the Human Rights Commission will attempt to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in city government and in the larger community. So it gave the commission permission to do more than just go looking at discrimination. It's been looking at homelessness, for example, as a huge issue here in town. And while there was little blowback on that from a couple of more conservative city council members, they passed it unanimously, and that changed what the Human Rights Commission is able to do. So if I have to think back to something I made an actual contribution to, not by myself, again working with other people, but I was driven, to get them to do more than just hand out the Universal Declaration. I wanted them to address some of the other human rights violations that were in the Universal Declaration, and they've been doing that. So that's been hopeful. We're not a human rights city. I always said that we should aspire to be a human rights city. Lots of other cities just sort of proclaim they're human rights cities. I think you have to earn it. And I think when you look around at some of the problems in the city, especially with homelessness and the way the city has been dealing with that, not any worse necessarily than some other cities, but it doesn't make us look good in terms of the human right to housing, the human right to a lot of different kinds of things, personal protection, health care. And that's something that I think if we could get much further along in dealing with homelessness, I would feel better about saying that, there's good spirit here. I think we're on the way to being a human rights city. Let's call ourselves a human rights city, just to remind ourselves what we're supposed to be doing, kind of thing. But that all remains to be seen. And I've learned an enormous amount through all these activities. And I would say to anybody who wants to become involved in human rights, become involved with organizations in the city. They may not identify as doing human rights work. For example, the NAACP doesn't necessarily identify itself as a human rights organization, but the work that they do is human rights work. And when I was talking to city employees, I would say, you may not know it, but you're doing human rights work. And they'll kind of look at me, what do you mean? They said, the guy who's out there in the machine that paints the white stripes up the middle of the street so that people know not to get into accidents by driving into one another. He's doing human rights work. There's a human right to life. And if he saves lives by doing that work, he's doing human rights work. And when I put it that way, I wasn't criticizing them. I was just saying, think about it differently. You're doing this work, but you're not really putting the work in context. That provided them a context which made them feel good. Oh, yeah, I am doing something important. So city employees were very willing to listen to us. And for a while there, we had a thing going where different departments in the city would submit nominees for a human rights award because of something that one of their employees was working on or starting up or whatever. And we would have a meeting and the mayor would come and we'd serve snacks and their names would be read and they'd get a little certificate and things like that. I'm not sure that remains, has continued to be done, but there was no resistance really on the part of city employees to being told this. I think the wrong way to do it might have been to go in and say, here's the Universal Declaration. You guys are really falling short of living up to the standards here. I don't think that would have gotten us very far. But to go to the police and say, you have human rights too. And they'd say, but I'm always being accused of violating human rights. Well, you have human rights too. You have the human right to safety, be able to get home at night, to your own life. And you don't want to be a human rights violator, obviously. But let's keep in mind that we need to care about you too. Because human rights are they're inalienable. Every single person, by virtue of being human, has human rights. And that includes members of the police department, who can be treated very badly sometimes. And sometimes you could say, well, maybe they deserve it. But I think the problem is much more complicated than that. And they put up with a hell of a lot of bad stuff. I went through the Civilian Police Academy, which showed me what they actually do. And it was quite an education. It didn't make me lovers of the police, but it certainly gave me an appreciation for the dirty job that was often involved there. Dangerous, dirty, alienating, and they have human rights. So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I've mentioned, is probably one of the most read documents around the world, and it was something that came out of World War II. That nations are horrified by the Holocaust and other things that went on, decided they wanted to identify the rights that everybody had by virtue of being human. And these rights covered a broad array of things, from the right to vote, to the right to an education, to the right to health care, and it was voted upon by the United Nations. All countries are members of the United Nations at that time, and the United Nations actually tries to enforce these rights around the world, and takes information about violations and attempts to communicate and educate people about these violations, and attempts to they call it blame and shame countries that are doing these terrible things to their residents, to stop, bring attention to these types of things. So here in the United States, we were talking about implementing the Universal Declaration here in the United States. Something like the right to vote, which is now threatened in many communities around the country due to gerrymandering and efforts on the part of one party to ensure that its members always get elected, and the relationship between suppression of voting rights and race. These are all human rights violations that can easily be identified in that way. There's also been a whole set of attention devoted to police brutality in the United States. George Floyd murder, and all the other people that have been killed by police, being seen as a violation of people's human rights in so many instances. Education, obviously, is something. I often think of human rights as things that must exist in order for people to reach their full potential as human beings. Okay, so if you can't vote and you're always being told what to do, if you can't be educated and so you can't advance, you can't improve your situation in life, if you can't be treated respectfully and with dignity by the police, all these things are grind down on you. And so, for example, when we have people coming into the country as immigrants or as asylum seekers, these are usually people that are fleeing conditions that are making their lives untenable. And I did spend time in Mexico, in Oaxaca, going to little rural villages, raising the question, why is there hardly anybody here in this village except women, the elderly, and children? It's because the men could only support their families by leaving and by going either elsewhere in Mexico or into the United States for jobs. Whole families leave. Children leave alone. Why would anyone want to leave their culture, their land, their families, their relatives, their way of life, unless it was something really horrible going on that they just couldn't deal with it anymore? And usually what they can't deal with are human rights violations that are coming down. So the people that are coming into the United States, and again, some experience dealing with immigrant rights and knowing immigrants, are here because um, they would die. They might die otherwise. You know, whether from political violence or hunger, um, economic violence. Um, so yeah, human rights they encompass a broad category of things. They're interrelated with one another. Um, they're they're yours by virtue of the fact that you're human. Governments can't give human rights. They can't take away human rights. You have the human rights at all times. Now, whether they're actually honored or not is the issue. And to get those human rights honored, that's why often we have social movements. That's why we have protests. That's why we have court cases um, that will try to get at these violations that people are suffering under. Well, looking to the future with regard to human rights, I mean, I think there's certain things that are occurring that are on their way that would be important to take a human rights lens to try to understand them, how they might deprive people of their ability to reach their full potential as human beings. And I'll mention at least two. Maybe I can think of three. But I think one of the things that's already very visible is the changing demographics of the United States. And as it becomes made up of more people of color, there's a tremendous resistance that's built on the part of whites who fear that they lose their white superiority and are fighting back. And this shows itself not only in the gerrymandering that's going on to divide up voting opportunities in the states, but also with regard to something like the immigration situation with people coming in to the country from elsewhere, fleeing, trying to find safety and a better way of life. Um, so there could be increased efforts to impose white supremacy and increased efforts to fight that going on. Um, I think climate change is something that's really important. People don't talk about it a whole lot with regard to its social implications or its implications for human rights. But people have a human right to life, people have a human right to health. And if we're doing things as we are that are threatening to human life, to human extinction, then there's going to be resistance to that. I have a T-shirt that says "Respect existence or expect resistance," and I think that captures it pretty well. We don't know where all this is going. There's a really great lawsuit that's being pursued by a group of youth in this country who seem to be on their way to success to getting actually heard in a court, which is attacking the policies around fossil fuels and so forth, which are helping to advance and worsen climate change and literally create climate refugees. I'll bring up one more that I don't think anybody really has been talking about in human rights terms. I'm sure somebody has, but I haven't seen it recently. And that is artificial intelligence. There is the notion that by creating machines that can make decisions so much faster than people can make them, that they could take over and do things to people that we would otherwise consider undesirable. To give you an example, I was reading an article about artificial intelligence being used in hospitals, where the machine registers certain metrics and parameters and so forth, which then instruct the nurses, um, this is happening. These are the medicines you need to give. When the nurses themselves, those that have years of experience, are looking at the patient and saying, "No, that's not right. That's not happening. I've seen this before." And yet, in some hospitals, they insist that the nurses follow um, the paradigm or whatever they're calling it that comes out of the machine, and it turns out often to the detriment of the patients. So who are we going to control? And how do you control the people who are telling the nurses that they have to obey the machine when the nurses themselves know that this is going to be harmful to people? People have a human right to health. We introduce certain kinds of technology in between the decision maker and the patient that can be detrimental to the patient. That human right is being violated. So that's just one example. They're also talking now about how machines can make decisions so fast that they may decide that we really do need to send missiles over to the Soviet Union or to Russia. It's not the Soviet Union anymore, to Russia, and strike first. Well, what if the other side wasn't planning on striking us? Now they will. Okay, so we could have a nuclear Armageddon, destroying much of the planet, simply because we've invented these machines that we are putting great faith in, which may not be able to be trusted that much. So I think that there's a lot of things. It may sound like science fiction, talk about artificial intelligence, but there are signs that this is becoming more and more of an issue for people. So there are things that are almost purely social and political, and then there are things that are technological as well that have human rights implications. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, there was no right to a safe environment. We didn't have, in 1945 or whenever it was written, we didn't have environmental problems like we have now. Well, we did, and maybe we didn't recognize them, because warfare itself is a terrible environmental negative influencer. But now human rights advocates are saying we need to pay attention to this. People should have environmental rights. Other people are saying maybe the environment should have rights, right not to be abused by human beings. We're not at the center of everything all the time, although we might like to think we are. So I think there's a lot of issues that are out there, that learning about human rights, where they came from, where this conception came from, how they're protected, how you can advocate for human rights, a lot of information out there would be very helpful for people in the future who want to do organizing. And one of the things I like about the human rights framework is that it's all encompassing. So, we at the Eugene Human Rights Commission, we'd have these annual human rights days, which they still have, but we would invite people to table from all these nonprofits in the city that were doing good things to help people. And we did that because we wanted them to acknowledge that they were doing human rights work. And I remember one year, maybe the first or second year I was involved with it, we asked the people that were invited to table to bring with you some kind of a sign showing what human right the work that you're doing actually supports. And they were all able to do it. They all, they might have called up and had some questions about it, but they were all able to do it. So I think, just, again, going back to the reframing issue, thinking about what we're doing differently and understanding that people who have AIDS, it's not just a favor you're doing them to offer medical assistance or preventive assistance. It's their right to have that information. It's their life that's at stake. And you start thinking about all the things that we try to do for people, all the needs that need to be met in a city like Eugene, you begin to see that people have a lot of reason to cooperate with one another rather than compete with one another. Groups shouldn't silo themselves from one another. Members of the Latin American community and the African American community and the Muslim community, they all have things in common. And they joining together, you can get a lot more done, put a lot more pressure on government, corporations, universities, than you can acting as a single siloed groups. And that's, I think, another advantage of the whole human rights framework, is that it gives people a common ground, a common language to work together and accomplish things. I mean, how do you get people involved? The Human Rights Commission is supposed to be doing outreach and education on human rights. It says so in the ordinance. I don't think it's doing it. But if the Human Rights Commission doesn't even read its own ordinance, and and really follow through. I mean, I think the whole idea of Human Rights City has kind of died on the vine since I left. You know, one of the things that you really needed was a champion. I've written published articles on Eugene doing human rights work, and you know, we had champions. You know, even the city manager was a champion. John Reese, while he might not have been a human rights expert or cared that much about it, he still was willing to support it. You know, he was still willing to put money up for it. And Kitty Piercy, she wasn't quite sure what to do with it, but she was always willing to sign declarations declaring December 10th Human Rights Day. She was even quoted in some articles, and you know, newspaper articles about human rights, which I made sure that she saw. Yeah, I mean, people watching this, if you said, well, you might already be doing human rights work. Well, you need to know what the human rights are that are out there, and you'll figure it out. If there's a human right to health and healthcare, and you're a nurse, you're doing human rights work. You got it. You know, be proud of what you're doing. You know, and you're also a worker. Okay, so there's a human right to organize as labor, organize. So you know, you're a worker. Be proud of that. Don't let anybody push you around. Uh, but you know, one of the most fundamental things that I think I worry about is whether there's a contradiction between capitalism and human rights. Can you really have human rights within a capitalist society such as our own, in which political and economic power are so concentrated? Um, Even sociologists declared in their major journal, the American Sociological Association, this is not a democracy. Um, what does that mean? You know, when you try to the human right to housing, you see how that that works here in Eugene. Um, it's taken years of fighting. I think it was 2007 when I first started getting involved in that. This is 2023, and still not being adequately taken care of. There's still 4,000 people who are homeless in Eugene, and 2/3 of them don't have shelter. Not even shelter. I'm not talking about housing. You know, they don't even have a shelter they can go to that's safe and clean and adequate to meet people's needs. So the problems are there, and you know, I think human rights pushes you to hold up these kinds of standards for people.